let's jump straight away into the logical problem of the incarnation.
Yeah. Logically speaking, when we say something is true, what we really mean is that it's sound. An argument is sound if it meets both standards of logic, meaning it's valid, its structure is perfect, and all of its premises are true. You need both these, folks. And if you can't get both, your position in false. And how this works is that we can reject people's conclusions, whether it's Unitarian, Trinitarian, if we reject one of the premises. But what we can't do is just reject a conclusion if we accept them. Because if the structure is perfect and the premises are true, the conclusion follows by necessity. And so for the hypostatic union to be true, it must be sound, being both structurally perfect and its premises are true. And this is the problem. It cannot meet both of these criteria. And I want to be clear.
I think Mike, an issue when it comes to defining logical, because when he defines the term logical, he thinks to mean that it just refers to something being both valid and sound, but that doesn't really make sense. It's deductive arguments specifically, which can be valid, invalid, sound, and insound. Mere worldviews, which are like just going to be sets of propositions that don't have to contain any deduction, they can't be valid or unsound. That's just like a category error almost, right? Because validity and soundness are something that apply to deductive arguments. So it doesn't make sense to apply those categories to a worldview because there doesn't have to be a deduction in a worldview necessarily, right? You can just have like a set of propositions. And like validity in an argument specifically, I should say, or like a formal argument, just like refers to how there's like a deduction which follows from a set of premises via an inference rule. So if you have P therefore Q, P therefore Q, that's just going to be true via modus ponens. That's the inference rule there. That's what makes it valid. But soundness just refers to an argument being valid and having a true set of premises. The issue is that these are going to be applicable specifically to formal arguments or just deductive arguments in general, right? So saying that a worldview is deductively invalid doesn't make sense because worldviews don't have to contain deductions in them. So when Mike sets this up as his criteria, I just think he's misusing the terms valid and sound. And when we look at the hypostatic union specifically, right, that also is just going to refer to like either like a metaphysical model where we have like some set of propositions meant to explain who the historical Jesus was, or it's going to refer to like some worldview, which once again is just going to be like a set of propositions. So the issue is that that set of propositions doesn't have to contain like a deduction in it. It's just going to be a set of propositions explaining what is believed by, let's say, at the Council of Ephesus or at Chalcedon, right? So there's no need to have a deduction in that set of propositions, meaning that applying the term valid and or invalid or sound or unsound doesn't really make sense. It's a category error. Furthermore, right, when we say in the context of like a debate, especially between two people who are like meant to be knowledgeable in philosophy, the issue is that when we say X is illogical, when we're talking about some like worldview or belief where X refers to said worldview, all the term illogical is going to refer to is just how the set of propositions is internally inconsistent, meaning that like meaning that at one or more of the propositions, once you look at what those propositions entail, are going to like involve a violation of like the axioms of that system or with like another proposition in that set. So like if you have P, Q, R, and then you have R entails not P, that's going to result in a logical inconsistency because if you have P and then R entails not P, then obviously you're going to have an issue with the law of non-contradiction because from R and R therefore not P, you can derive not P, but then obviously we have P in that set of propositions. So that's what it typically means when we say something is illogical in this context. But it seems that Mike wants to mean something else. So what this basically sets up is that Mike is framing the debate in a way that Bryce has to prove that the hypostatic union is sound to demonstrate that the incarnation is logical. But that's just not the case, right? Because Bryce, all he has to do is just demonstrate a model of the hypostatic union which is consistent. Plus, I do think Bryce did a good job of proving the hypostatic union is true anyways, though. But regardless, he didn't need to do that. But yeah, I think we can continue with the video, because after this, Mike gives the LPI.
Assertions cannot be true in the same respect because man and God have opposite essential properties. Bryce actually already agreed to this. And by essential property, that's defined as one that a thing must have to remain that thing. The law of non-contradiction states a thing cannot be P and not P at the same time and in the same respect. But that's exactly what the hypostatic union asserts when it says Jesus is one. And I want to make this very clear. All right. The same respect or sense is the one person of Christ. Can I get that in chat? Can I have some of my followers in chat put this in? Ready? It's the one person of Christ. The natures of Christ posit contradictory properties. For example, man by nature is passible, finite, and limited. That's literally what it means to be a human. But God is just the opposite. He is impassible, infinite, and unlimited. Both of these assertions can simply not be true in the same respect. But that's exactly what the hypostatic union does when it asserts that Christ is one person with the property of both natures. So you got to understand, these properties are not just different, they're opposite and contradictory to each other. Okay? So it literally says, their creed, that the properties of both natures are preserved in one person. It's over, it's done, folks. This violates the law of non-contradiction, and it's the same for the law of excluded middle, which says that for any proposition P, it's either P or not P. Okay, in reality, Jesus can either be God and not a man, or he can be a man and not be God ontologically. There is no third option because, again, man and God have opposite essential properties, right?
But now we can get into like what Timothy Paul calls the fundamental problem of Christology, where the argument is basically right, is that Christ has both divine and human predicates, and this is going to entail a contradiction because one and the same person has predicates proper to the divinity and proper to humanity, and yet these sets of properties have contradictions within them, meaning that you can't have one person with a human set of properties and a divine set of properties at the same time. Now, to begin, we can give what is called like the simple answer, and that's just by saying humanity and divinity are not essentially contradictory to each other in the sense that it's like not the case that they have mutually exclusive predicates such that one person can't have both at the same time. Now, what is actually contrary to God is sin and fallen humanity. Fallen humanity is contradictory to God. And we kind of covered this when we talked about concupiscence and how Jesus was tempted, right? The idea is that fallen humanity and how fallen humanity, I guess you could say, endures sin or endures temptation, that is going to be contradictory to God, meaning that a divine person cannot assume a fallen human nature. However, we don't say that Christ assumes a fallen human nature. Christ is not a fallen human, right? He's going to be a sinless human. So since sin is what contradicts God, not necessarily humanity, the objection falls apart. And we're going to get more into this, right? We can also apply this to other Unitarian polemics. It's like the objection from Numbers 23:19 doesn't really work because Numbers 23:19 is dealing with fallen humanity. And we know this because the rationale behind Numbers 23:19 is that men are liars. God is not a man and transcends men, so therefore he wouldn't be a liar as well. But the issue is that this is only going to be applicable in the context of the Torah's theology to people posterior to the fall, not necessarily prior to it, right? So before Adam, there wasn't sin, and Adam wouldn't be a liar prior to the fall. And similarly, after Christ comes back and we get the new heaven and new earth, there's not going to be any sin or lies either. Yet, before Adam's fall and after the eschaton, we're still going to be human, right? So what this indicates is that Numbers 23:19 isn't talking about like humanity in its very like essence, in its unfallen state, but rather it's talking about like how fallen humanity is contradictory to God. So the meaning of this passage is just going to be that God cannot be a fallen man. Now, if we go to the next slide, what someone could do, right, is they could give, I guess you could say, a more sophisticated version of the LPI where they like give a bunch of premises and then show that they're going to entail a contradiction, or like a bunch of propositions and show they entail a contradiction. So one example is going to be all men are mortal. Jesus is a man. Therefore, Jesus is mortal. Anything which is fully divine is immortal. Jesus is fully divine. Therefore, Jesus is immortal. And then it's going to follow that Jesus is mortal and immortal. And they're going to say that this is a contradiction. Now, how we gave the initial or like simple response is going to frame sort of how I give my, I guess you could say, more sophisticated response to this. But the simple way to explain it is that the negation of mortality as it's used in premise 4 isn't going to be in the same sense as mortality in premise 3, right? So mortality can refer to something being a non-eternal person, or it can refer to something having a body and soul which can be separated. Christ is immortal in the first sense of the term mortal, but he is mortal in the second sense. So Christ is immortal because he is eternal, but Christ is mortal in the sense that he has a body and soul which could be separated. One analogy you could use is the body and soul analogy to kind of explain how this works in ordinary language. So the person is composed of both body and soul. The body is material, the soul is immaterial. The person possesses both at the same time. So the person is both material and immaterial. It's just that we qualify how or why they're material and immaterial. And this is going to give like a analogy for the incarnation, which kind of demonstrates how these predicates aren't contradictory. Just notice how with the body soul analogy, we have materiality and immateriality, which are supposedly going to be contradictory, and yet we can apply them to one and the same subject because we distinguish between the senses of the term material and immaterial. So we can kind of apply this to the incarnation where, as I've explained, mortality and immortality are going to be distinguished. We're distinguishing the senses in which we apply them to Christ. So one is applied in virtue of his humanity and the other is applied in virtue of his divinity.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
soul
we have,
body analogy really helps with showing that it's just super common in everyday language.
yeah, we have
Hamza Hussein says, "How do Oriental Orthodox deal with what Mike was saying?"
well, we're gonna get into this later, but they'll use a constitution. So they'll say that you can have this is what they'll call it. You can have the two repugnant predicates like material and immaterial being applied to the same subject as long as the constituents have one of those, right? So what they're going to say is that the one composite nature is constituted by the divinity and humanity, and those are going to constitute the a one composite nature. So what they're going to say is because the humanity and divinity are the two constituents of it, you can have both materiality and immateriality. That's kind of the way they would respond to it. If you go to the next slide, we'll kind of go even further into this. So one thing we have to remember when it comes to a contradiction is that a proposition is being denied and accepted in the same sense and at the same time. Now, this is important because there's going to be plenty of examples of allegedly contradictory predicates being applied to one and the same thing in ordinary language. Now, remember, the job of the metaphysician is to explain how and or if ordinary language statements are true. In other words, they have to come up with some model to explain how these statements work. And coming up with a model to help explain these contradictions or alleged contradictions in ordinary language statements, such as man is material and immaterial, will help us solve the LPI, right? So this is what the patristics did with the body and soul analogy. So because of that, it'll be useful to look at some analogies given below. So obviously we have the body and soul analogy, right? Man is constituted of body and soul, and thus is both material and immaterial because the body is material and the soul is material. Likewise, someone in Hong Kong can say the sky is blue, whereas someone in Texas may say the sky is not blue. A lollipop is white and red. It is white as the stick, but it's red as like the edible portion, right? So there's going to be an edible portion of the lollipop, which is red, but then there's going to be like the stick portion, which is white. And then let's go with another, I guess you could say, analogy or thought experiment. Suppose substance dualism is true and that the body and person are really distinct. Then suppose God creates someone who has two bodies. Now, one body is arranged in such a way that it is in a chair with its legs bent, etc. The other body has its legs straight, is on the floor, upright, etc. Is this person sitting or standing? The answer seems to be both, because this person is sitting with respect to one body, but standing with respect to another. Now, one could go against this and say, like, this example is far fetched or improbable, but that's fine because we use these types of analogies in philosophy to illustrate a point, right? Thought experiments basically help us understand metaphysics better or just reality in general, right? So for example, the trolley problem is going to be highly unrealistic, but the point of it is to like show your intuitions in terms of morality. So likewise, even if you want to say this analogy is like far-fetched, the point of the analogy is kind of to show how our like intuitions think about these things. Now, so another example is given by Eleanor Stump in a review of the Logic of God Incarnate by Thomas V. Morris. She says, consider this proposition analogous to the reduplicative, and remember, reduplicative would be like qua man or qua divinity, right? Which we're going to get into a bit. Now, she says an analogous proposition is going to be Socrates as Caucasian is light colored, and Socrates as dark haired is not light colored. As the objection characterizes such propositions, it predicates being Caucasian of Socrates and being dark haired of Socrates. Being Caucasian entails being light skinned and so light colored, and being dark haired entails being not light colored. So, applying the objections line, we should apparently say that this proposition is just a complicated way of attributing contradictory properties, namely being light colored and not being light colored to Socrates. What is wrong with this analysis of reduplicative propositions about Socrates, of course, is that it disregards the very reduplicative character of the propositions it was meant to analyze. The proposition about Socrates does not predicate contradictory attributes of Socrates because the contradictory attributes in question are attributed to Socrates only in virtue of being attributed to certain separate features of Socrates. That is, they are not predicated of Socrates' simplicator, but only in a certain respect. Similarly, the property of being omnipotent as well as the property of being God is not predicated of Christ's simplicator, but only in respect to his divine nature. The same can be said about the property of being limited in power as well as the property of being human. So the reduplicative proposition is not just a complicated way of attributing contradictory attributes to a subject. Consequently, we do not have good reason for dismissing the S strategy, and we're going to get into like different strategies of qualifications. Now, one thing though, I would disagree with Stump here, and I would hold something closer to Pawl's solution, but we're going to get into that a bit. However, the analogy is kind of useful, right? There's a sense in which Socrates is light colored, and there's a sense in which he's not light colored, right? He has dark hair, but not dark skin, and vice versa. He has light skin, but not light hair. And so, in a sense, he is light colored and not light colored at the same time. So I didn't get to mention this during stream, but I want to mention it now as I do think it's something useful to bring up. But so far, what we've basically been talking about is how there are certain cases in which we affirm a term applies to a subject, but then negate that same term to that same subject at the same time, but then avoid contradiction because there's a different sense in which that term is being applied. So for example, when we say man is both material and immaterial, the term material is being negated and affirmed, but just in different senses. And so the analogies we've been going at or looking at have just been dealing with how we can see those types of scenarios pop up in ordinary non-theological language. However, we can give analogies from scripture, not just from our own scripture, but also, for example, from the Quran. And this isn't because we take the Quran to be authoritative, but this has to do with the fact that Muslims often like to run the logical problem of the Incarnation, just like MetaphysicsMike. And so if we can show these same analogies within their Quran, then that's going to basically cast doubt on their ability to run the logical problem of the Incarnation and yet be consistent with their paradigm. So to begin, we can actually look at something which is consistent in both the Quran and the New Testament. So basically, both seem to affirm that persons who are saved but then died are alive and not alive or dead at the same time. It's just that they distinguish the senses in which alive is taken. So there's a sense in which they are alive and there's a sense in which they are not alive. So this is going to be the case because there's a sense in which they are biologically dead, right? So their bodies are no longer alive, biologically speaking, but then they are in heaven. And so because of that, they're going to be alive. So from the Christian perspective, it says God is not the God of the dead, but God of the living. And this is obviously going to be in Matthew 22:32. Now, interestingly, right, the NET footnote on this passage, I think, summarizes it pretty clearly. Essentially, what the argument here is going to be, or the point that Jesus is making, is that God could identify himself as God of the three patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because of the fact that they were still alive when God spoke to Moses. And this is because of the fact that they're alive in a sense because they are in heaven. And so because of that, they must be raised from the dead for God to be the God of the living. Now, when it comes to the Islamic corpus, what we can see is that in the Quran, it actually says that Muslim soldiers or believing soldiers do not kill their enemies, but rather Allah is the one that does it. And note that this doesn't deny that there's any sense in which soldiers kill their enemies, but rather it denies that there's a specific sense. So there's a sense in which soldiers do not kill, but then there's a sense in which they do. So soldiers both kill and do not kill at the same time. However, Muslims distinguish the senses in which soldiers kill but then do not kill. Likewise, in Quran 2, verse 154 and chapter 3, 169, it says that the martyrs are not going to be dead despite being killed. And this is because of the fact that they are in heaven. So notice there's a sense in which the martyrs are killed, but then there's also a sense in which they're not dead, meaning they were not killed. And this is going to obviously be important because that means that the concept underlying each of the analogies is going to be found in the Quran. Because the point that we're making here is not that like the Quran is going to be authoritative, but rather we're kind of pointing out that one, the idea that I'm getting at is that like some terms are affirmed of a subject in one sense, but then negated of that same subject in another sense at the same time without contradiction. And what this shows is that this is not going to be exclusive to the Christian tradition, but also in other traditions. And obviously, the Quranic tradition is going to be one example of this because the Quran is obviously not going to be part of Christian theology. And also, we can point out that the body-soul analogy works for basically any tradition that accepts an immaterial soul and a material body. Similarly, this analogy with like the sky or the lollipop seems to be applicable to anyone, including physicalists. Second, I think that the fact that the Quran is using this idea of a negation and an affirmation but in different senses shows how intuitive this idea is, because in the Quranic context, this idea came up in a completely different scenario with no motivation to defend the incarnation. In fact, the Quran denies the incarnation. In other words, two opposed paradigms, Christianity and Islam, ended up accepting this concept because of how intuitive or self-evident it was. Overall, what this shows is that the analogies we are using are not just limited to the Christian paradigm. Further, if someone accuses the Quran of being contradictory because it says that martyrs are killed but not dead, the Muslim will easily respond by just qualifying the senses in which they are dead and not dead. In other words, they distinguish the senses. However, at that point, it would seem to be arbitrary for them to critique Christians of also doing the same because they qualify the predicates that are given to Christ. In other words, Muslims like to critique Christians for qualifying the senses in which we predicate certain predicates to Christ. So, for example, we may say Christ is material qua humanity, but immaterial qua divinity. However, it seems that they would have to do something similar when it comes to their own texts, because they have to negate and affirm a term. It's just they have to say that that term is being used in different senses. And it seems that any objection that can be given to Christian qualifications of sentences can be given to the Muslim qualifications as well. And this is going to make it somewhat inconsistent for a Muslim to argue that the LPI works whilst they have a similar issue within their own tradition. Now, finally, we can also give an analogy from like an Old Testament perspective, because many passages in the Old Testament imply that God is not seen, but then there are theophanies in the Old Testament in which God is seen. And so this is going to like obviously raise the question as to like how this is compatible. And in these cases, the solution is that we distinguish the senses in which God is seen and which God is not seen. So, for example, one solution that is given is that God the Father is not seen, but then God the Son is seen. Obviously, someone like MetaphysicsMike or another Unitarian won't accept this. However, this is obviously acceptable to a Trinitarian. Second, if you accept essence-energies distinction, you can say God is seen via the divine energies, but not via his unknown essence. So notice how we're distinguishing the senses. We're distinguishing seeing the energies versus seeing the essence. And so God is seen according to his energies, but not according to his essence. Now, from a perspective that rejects the essence-energies distinction, we could say that God is seen via a created manifestation, but he is not seen in his infinite essence. And this is going to be important because we have to point out that Jews and Unitarians both accept the Old Testament as scripture. And so when they interpret these passages about God both being seen and not seen, they're going to also have to qualify the statements, right? So they're going to have to distinguish the senses. And so the same point we made about Muslims can be made here. Remember, both Unitarians and Jews are going to have to say that when they look at these passages, that there's a sense in which God is seen, and then there's another sense in which God is not seen. And they're going to have to basically explain this by saying that the statements are going to be qualified in some way. And the obvious issue then is that it's going to be arbitrary for them to accept this form of qualification in the Old Testament, but then suddenly come and say that it's rejected in the New Testament. It's completely arbitrary to do that. In other words, it seems that Unitarians and Jews have their own version of the LPI in the Old Testament, in which we apply being seen and being not seen to God. Now, the Unitarian is going to want to solve that by just qualifying the senses in which God is seen and not seen, but then we can do the same when it comes to the predicates we apply to Christ. Now, if you go to the next slide, right, we kind of go more into this. So what the debate when it comes to the LPI focuses on is it's going to be called the Qua Solution. And this is what Bryce appeals to and what Mike attacks. Now, this is also known as reduplication in like the literature. Essentially, what it's doing is it's qualifying the statement in a particular way to make it so that the negation and affirmation aren't in the same sense. So like when we apply this to the body soul analogy, you can have man qua body is material, but man qua soul is immaterial. And that's how they're going to avoid the contradiction there. It's qua different respects, right? So qua just means insofar as. So, man, insofar as it is body, is going to be material. Now, to further explain this, Pawl categorizes the qua solutions in various types. So, firstly, in a sentence such as Christ is material, you're going to have the subject, Christ, the copula is, and the predicate, material. And you can qualify any one of these. Or you can say that the qua is at the beginning of the statement to modify the entire statement itself. And that gives us roughly 4 ways of reduplication. So what Pawl sort of classifies these as is that there's a subject method which indexes the subject, the copula method which indexes the copula, the predicate method which qualifies the predicate, and then the 4th way is just the assertion method, and that's just going to be modifying the assertion itself. Now, what's important, right, is that each of these are going to be different construals of modifying the same sentence. And that's going to be the one thing we're going to point out, and specifically we're going to cover the S model and the P model, which is going to be the subject model and the predicate model. One thing we're going to point out is that Mike's main critiques of the Qua model are going to be with respect to the S model, but they're not really going to address the P model. But that's going to be important because if Bryce is taking the P model, then like Bryce's model isn't going to be defeated just because Mike has defeated the S model. So to get into his critiques, I think it might be important to go look at what Mike says about the Qua model. So
if I may add, there are and this isn't just like in a philosophical matter or like a theological manner, but also like there's scriptural basis for like the distinction of qua man or like qua divinity. So, because like in the first epistle of Peter, there are a couple of times where he'll bring up saying like Christ died according to his flesh, or like Christ suffered. So in First Peter 4 verse 1, it says, "Since therefore Christ suffered in the flesh, arm yourselves with the same thought, for whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin." So obviously in the first half, it's saying Christ suffered in the flesh. So like when we say like Christ died, we can say Christ died according to his flesh. And then he says so in the same thing in the previous chapter, "For Christ also died for the sins of once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit." So there is this distinction of qua flesh, qua humanity in sacred scripture.
For sure. Helpful with that scriptural precedent, Maronite Scholastic, aka Dr. Bustdown. Let's go to the
Oh, yeah.
timestamp.
Qua argument, human divine nature, philosophy qua means in accordance with. That's what Bryce said. Ready? This is to claim that it's actually Jesus' human nature which was tempted or died or grew in virtues. And that would seem like it solves it because the natures act like a container that separates it from ever touching the other nature in Christ. But this is a blatant fallacy of refutation, which shifts a predicate of a person to an attribute of nature. This is also called a fallacy of hypostasization, where someone treats an abstract thing as though it were concrete. Simply put, folks, natures don't do things like be tempted or not tempted apart from person. It's a person who properly receives the predicate like temptation or dying. And honestly, this is ironic because they're the ones putting so much emphasis on the distinction between person and being that they can't even do it consistently. You just heard Bryce conflate natures as having attributes of persons. That's nonsense. When the scripture attributes properties like being tempted, dying, or not knowing, those apply to the person, not an abstract nature.
So those are going to be Mike's critiques of the Qua method, right? So he does engage with the Qua method. But one thing we'll see, right, is it's pretty obvious that what he's engaging with is the S model, right? So he's engaging with the S model. He's not engaging with the other models. So to give like a brief overview of the S model, I don't think Mike really gives that good of an explanation. What I think you should read Timothy Paul's explanation if you want a further elaboration. But what he says is this: consider the second way to understand qua clauses. The qua modifies the subject. On such a view, the subject of predication, Christ is impassible, is really Christ qua divine. Likewise, the subject of Christ is passible is really Christ qua human. And these are different subjects. For if it were one and the same subject being predicated by both passible and impassible, then there would be you would end up basically in like square one because there would still be a contradiction. right? So he says further, right? He says, recall on this view, the one and only way one guarantees different senses is by qua modification of the subject. But if qua modification doesn't provide distinct subjects, then the same thing is predicated by both a predicate and an inconsistent predicate. In our test case, by both passible and impassible. And so for the S theory to work, there must have been two subjects of predication. One that we call Christ qua human, and the other that we can call Christ qua divine. One should notice that on this view, it will not work to have some third subject of predication that both passible and impassible are apt of, for that is the very problem we're trying to avoid with the qua clauses. It is this affirmation of two distinct subjects of predications and the concomitant, okay, my pronunciation of that might be bad, denial of any third thing that shares the predicates that make the S theory unworkable for the conciliar Christologist. Conciliar Christology requires that there be one thing to which the divine and human predicates apply in the Incarnation. They both must apply to the person of Jesus Christ. So Paul kind of explains this. Now, what seems to be happening is that Mike is criticizing the S model, right? Because when he criticizes the qua, he's saying, oh, so well, according to the qua model, we're specifying the subject such that it's the human nature is X, Y, and Z, right? Rather than the person. This is only going to be applicable to the S model because if you look to the like classifications we gave, the S model is just one of them, and there's other models such that like you can qualify the predicate or you can even qualify the copula. And those aren't going to require that you shift the subject from the person to the human nature. It's just going to require that you distinguish the property itself or the copula itself. So I think Mike's sort of problem here is that it's changing the referent of Jesus from the person of Christ to one of his natures. And the issue that Mike has is going to be twofold. One, if we specify the subject by saying it is the nature being predicated over, then we're predicating properties like material to the natures. But natures are sets of properties. Sets are abstract, but no set can have a property of being material because materiality is a property only given to concrete objects. So what Mike concludes is that the qua move fails. Then second, he's going to say the properties are still in the same person. So we are left back at square one for the qua move. Essentially, what is said of the nature is said of the person. So the person still has two contradictory properties. Now, I'm not sure if Mike is familiar with Pawl or has even read him. If he did, that's even more problematic because if he read Pawl, he should be aware of these distinctions, which he's not, as we'll see in a bit. But he does seem to have a similar take when it comes to like the S model, right? His issue is like, the properties are given to the one and the same subject, so qualifying the subject doesn't work. Now, as to these critiques, Joshua Sijuwade actually like develops a framework which can address both MetaphysicsMike's and Timothy Paul's concerns with the S model, and uses aspectivalism and ontological pluralism. You can read that article if you want to get into that, but we're not really going to get into it because, as we'll see, if you go to the next slide, what the model that Bryce takes actually the P model. So in the debate, for example, he says there are two properties which are communicated to the one person. The sets are different, and because they are different, the properties are going to be different within each set. And so when we say that they both apply to the one person, materiality and immateriality are going to be qualified, right? So materiality is going to be qualified with coming from one nature, but then immateriality is going to be sourced from the other in a way. Or another way to put it is that materiality is communicated by the humanity, immateriality is communicated by the divinity. So Bryce is basically going to use the communication of idioms. Now, to apply the P model to some of the analogies we gave, right? The sky is blue qua Hong Kong, but not blue qua Texas. So there's one property of being blue insofar as it is in Hong Kong, but then there's another property of blue insofar as it is in Texas, one of which applies to the sky and the other does not apply to the sky. Likewise, we can do the same thing for the lollipop example, and we can do the same for the body-soul example, etc. Essentially, like the negations and affirmations are going to be in different because the properties themselves are different, right? So I guess to give an example, you can use the word Greek as referring to a language or referring to like an ethnicity, right? So the term Greek can be like a property of a language or it can be like a property of a person. However, the two terms mean different things. So, I can say like Socrates is Greek, where Greek is refers to the ethnicity, but then I can say Socrates is not Greek, where Greek refers to the language. So they're going to be in two different senses. Now, as I explained above, Mike's main criticism was of the S model. This means that Mike was strawmanning the entire debate. So, for example, like he assumes that if the predicates are in the same subject, then they're in the same sense. That's only going to follow if Bryce was qualifying only the subject, but not the predicate or the copula or the assertion. But Bryce holds to the P model. We should note that like Pawl does actually give objections to the P model. In fact, he gives objections to all the Qua models. But first, we should actually explain like the two ways of accepting the P model. As a side note, I also want to point out that SCOTUS seems to have accepted the P model. If you go to the next slide also, this is one thing I mentioned. I actually asked Bryce myself if he was using the P model during the debate, and he said yes, he was. So yeah, Mike was definitely strawmanning him there. Pawl gives a further breakdown as to how the P model works. So he says, consider the third way to read the qua clauses, the modifying of the predicate. The predicate is apt of Christ on this view is not passable simplicator. Rather, the predicates should be understood as internally modified. We can understand this internal modification in two ways, which I will call substitutional and non-substitutional. One can get an understanding for these two modified predicates by considering an example. Consider the two predicates identical with Leo the Great and identical with something or other. The latter, but not the former, is apt of you. You are not identical to Leo the Great, though you are identical with something or other. Logically, one can understand the first predicate as a one-place predicate. It is apt of something X when it is identical with Leo the Great. One might express the claim as follows. ILG, which is going to be its own property, applies to X, which can be read as the predicate identical with Leo the Great satisfied by X. The second case is an example of a two-place relation. It is apt of something X when X is identical with something Y, where one can substitute in anything one wants for the Y variable. One might express this claim as follows. The predicate I applies over X and Y, which can be read as the relation identical with holds between the relata X and Y. Now remember, relata is just going to refer to like the objects in a two-place predicate. Call the first understanding non-substitutional, and you can call the second understanding substitutional. Now, for this stream, I'm going to be using the terms one-place and two-place views because I think that's more clear. Either way, it's going to be referring to the same thing Pawl does. Basically, there's two ways of using this. You can either say that the predicate is qualified because the predicate is like a one-place predicate, and there's two distinct one-place predicates that you're predicating to Christ. Or you could say that there's one and the same predicate that both applies and not applies, but this predicate is a relational predicate, and so to say that it applies and not applies as long as the relata are different, right? So, for example, say you have a predicate F, where F means like fatherhood, right? So you can say that X is the father of Y, but X is not the father of Z. So here, the predicate F applies to X and Y, but does not apply over X and Z. So there's one sense in which F applies to X, and there's a sense in which it doesn't. What we can sort of summarize is that there's two different versions of the P model. Now, when it comes to the one-place P model, Pawl, what he wants to argue is that the councils don't seem to use the strategies, at least not explicitly. But in response, someone who holds to the P model could just say that like the P model is the best explanation given the metaphysics of the patristic authors, and so it's still going to be there implicitly. To be fair, though, Pawl also does cite patristic authors using the P model. Now, Pawl gives a second critique. He quotes another scholar, which gives a logical dilemma for the P model position. He basically asks, is Christ passable simplicator or impassable simplicator? Now, note that you can replace what's it called, like passable simplicator or impassable simplicator with like any other similar property. Now, simplicator just means unqualified. So remember, in the P model, we're qualifying the predicates. So when Pawl is asking, is Christ passable simplicator or impassable simplicator, he's asking without qualification. Now, what Pawl basically summarizes this dilemma as is, for any property, a thing will either have it or have its complement, meaning that it's a negation. One might say similarly, for any predicate, a thing will either be aptly described by it or its complement. And so even if the P theorist is right that Christ is passable qua human and impassable qua God, the P theorist still needs to give an answer to the question of whether Christ is passible simplicator or impassible simplicator. Now, one way that Paul says that a P theorist can get around this is by saying that like there is no such thing as a passible simplicator, and that all predicates are going to be like in virtue of a nature. But the issue is that this seems to be like ad hoc, right? You can say that like in a form, maybe someone wants to argue that this is ad hoc because it's introducing like new predicates which aren't going to be there in our language, and say that like there are certain statements such as humans and gorillas are mammals, which wouldn't be true even though we take them to be true in ordinary language, because humans qua humanity are mammals but not qua gorilla, whereas for gorillas it's going to be the reverse. So gorillas qua gorilla are going to be mammals but not qua human. So it would seem that under this maneuver that statement wouldn't be true if we denied that there's no such thing as predicate simplicator. However, right, one way to actually get around this entirely is by saying that Christ is impassible simplicator. And this is important because Paul's main critique is going to be that like if we deny simplicator predicates, then that seems to make our model basically ad hoc and thus unworkable in terms of like our ordinary language. But the issue is that if we just admit that, yeah, simplicator predicates do exist, and then say that Christ is impassible, that gets around the logical, or I should say, that picks one of the sides of the logical dilemma, that being Christ is impassible simplicator. Now, at this point, someone could say, oh, well, this seems to, I guess you could say, diminish the humanity of Christ, because Christ should be both passible and impassible, and saying that Christ is impassible simplicator, but not passible simplicator seems to damage that. But in response, right, someone could say something like this: Christ is really or materially identical to the divine nature, and Christ is a divine hypostasis, not a human hypostasis. So it isn't a theologically problematic thing to say that Christ is impassible simplicator or impassible in his personhood, right? Now, with this solution, I don't actually think there's any formal or logical issues. I don't really see any. At most, you can say that there's like a theological issue with saying Christ is impassible simplicator. Maybe Bustdown can speak on this, but I don't even think there's any theological issues with it either.
No, I wouldn't say there seems to be any issue with that.
So I think with the predicate model, we can just say that, yeah, Christ is impassible simplicator in virtue of being a divine hypostasis. But yeah. So the second way is going to be the two-place model. So under this view, there's one predicate and we're just changing one of the objects in the relation. So as I mentioned before, the term father can be taken as a two-place predicate. Another example that Paul gives is the example of Bob is to the left and Bob is to the right. Now, left is a two-place predicate. So B can be like to the left of A, but it cannot be to the left of L, right? So, you can say Bob is to the left of Alex, but not to the left of Luke. So Bob is left qua Alex, but not left qua Luke. So with the incarnation, maybe you could say like the son is mortal with respect to his body. And you can explicate that by saying mortality is going to be a two-place predicate where the son is going to be in the first area and then this human body is going to be the second. And then we can do the same thing for immortality and like with this divinity. Now, notice how like the divine nature and human body serve as like the relata in this context, and that's what's going to be what distinguishes from the one-place model. Now, I guess you could say the same thing can be brought up with P model 2 that were brought up with P model 1. So like it seems to be like an ad hoc analysis to take typically one-place predicates and label them as two-place predicates. But the issue is that you can give like counter examples to this. Like, let's say with the example I gave of like Bob is left qua Alex but not left qua Luke. That's going to be one example. Another one is just going to be like materiality and immateriality being predicated to the one person. So the one person is material and immaterial. You can say that a two-place model explains that the best. However, you can also say that like there are certain examples which break down when you apply the two-place model. Like for example, humans and gorillas are both mammals example. You can say that it breaks down there. But in response, you can like give a similar response we did in the first P model. So you can say that there can be like one-place predicates such as passible and impassible or mammal. However, it's just that in the case of Christ specifically, or in the case of humans specifically, material and immaterial are going to be two-place predicates. Now, I didn't ask Bryce which model he takes, whether he takes the P model, like the one-place one or the two-place one. My guess is that he takes the one-place one. Either way, though, I think the one-place one might be the best. I'm not too sure out of the different P models. Regardless, I think both are going to be formally consistent. Now, perhaps Mike wants to like change this, and he kind of does, right? He wants to say that like these lead to like ad hoc semantics because Mike wants to argue that in the Gospels we see Christ is material or like Christ is limited without any qualification, and so like it's ad hoc to suggest qualification, right? So if someone wants to say Christ is material qua man, they need to add the qua man part. Being material qua man isn't going to be like sufficient to ground the truth value of the statement Christ is material as seen in the Gospels. Now, the way the P model like theorist might respond to this is by saying we shorten qualified statements all the time in ordinary language. So it isn't ad hoc to posit the Gospels do the same. So like for example, right, when we gave the examples of the man is material qua body, but immaterial qua, that's going to be directly applicable to Christ. And so because in those cases being material in virtue of your body is sufficient for saying that the man is just material, like in an there's not really going to be an issue with saying the Gospels do the same, right? There's no reason to expect them to explicitly say they're qualifying the predicate, given that we never qualify the predicate in like ordinary language statements because we don't have to qualify it. So, like on the contrary, it is a sufficient condition to ground the truth value of the statements Christ is material or Christ is limited.
Yeah. If I could also add another way, you could also like say this is you could say like the person of Christ is like composed, and then you can like assume a certain premise with that, like where you don't necessarily have to say like well man, because if you understand the person of Christ to be composed of both God and man, you can assume the premise of like, okay, if you're saying if we know that God is immaterial and we say Christ is material, and we know that he's God and man, we must be saying that according to the humanity of him, he is material. And here's what St. Thomas says on like whether the person of Christ is composite. He says in Tertia Pars, in Summa Theologica Tertia Pars, question 2, article 4, he writes, I answer that the person or hypostasis of Christ may be viewed in two ways. First, as it is in himself, and thus is altogether simple, even as the nature of the word. Second, in the aspect of the person or hypostasis to which it belongs to subsist in a nature, and thus the person of Christ subsists in two natures. Hence, though there is one subsisting being in him, yet there are different aspects of subsistence, and hence he is said to be a composite person inasmuch as one being subsists in two.
Mm-hmm. Now, so this is kind of one thing I mentioned earlier. Timothy Pawl gives critiques of the Qua method as a whole, and he's actually going to deny the like Qua method in its entirety. Now, we actually did cover his arguments. I think Timothy Paul's arguments do actually fail against the Qua method. However, right, I also think it's useful to give a solution to kind of explain how I would read these texts, or like how I would solve the fundamental problem. So, what Timothy Pawl is going to say is that he's just going to deny that the predicates that are being applied are actually like contradictory at all, even when they're unqualified. Remember, the traditional Qua solution involves modifying the sentence. So, what Paul is saying is that we don't need to modify the sentence. We just need to distinguish or like specify what we mean by our terms. So, like, take the predicates material and immaterial. Paul is going to say that we need to revise the truth conditions of those predicates. And once we revise those truth conditions, they're no longer going to be contradictory. So he says, like with material and immaterial, the term material just means a supposit is going to have a concrete nature that is tangible. However, for some supposit to be immaterial, it is not the case that we're negating materiality in every sense, but rather all we're saying is that there's some concrete nature that is untangible. So Christ's human nature is tangible, Christ's divine nature is not. Therefore, Christ is both immaterial and material because he has a concrete nature which is tangible and a concrete nature which is not tangible. So notice like how the contradiction is solved by saying that material and immaterial have their own truth conditions which aren't in conflict. In other words, the meaning of material is such that it does not exclude immaterial. Now, in this context, I should explain what concrete nature is, and we're going to get into this in a bit. And just in this context, just know that it refers to like either the divine nature or to the human nature, which are both seen as concrete objects rather than mere abstract sets. And we're going to cover this later. The human nature in the human nature of Christ in a concrete view is basically just going to be like the composite of body and soul that Christ possessed, and the divine nature would be the one concrete substance that each of the persons would be identified with. Now, Paul isn't just going to apply this to like the predicates material and immaterial, but also to the predicates like mortal, immortal, immutable, mutable, etc. Right? Essentially, having a nature that is tangible and having a nature that is intangible are not contradictory in the case that Christ has two natures. So saying that Christ has two natures actually does avoid the contradiction because Christ has one intangible concrete nature and a distinct concrete nature which is intangible. Now, like if you want a very in-depth defense, I would recommend reading his 2015 paper, his 2016 book, and then his 2019 book. That's going to defend his model here. But if you want like a free, I guess you could say, defense of his view, look at his interviews with like the Analytic Christian. He goes into that a bit there. Now, if you go to the next slide, there's going to be like some problems with this view. I don't think they're really that damaging. They're definitely not going to be any logical issues, right? It's going to be definitely formally consistent. However, there are some areas we could improve on. So for starters, we should drop the condition of needing a concrete nature. So the man is material and immaterial. That is because the man is a body that is tangible and a soul that is intangible. Yet in one person where they're united, the body and soul compose one concrete nature. They're not going to be their own like two distinct concrete natures. So the man is material and immaterial without having two natures. So I think Paul is going to have to revise his conditions to work with that analogy because the patristics use that analogy. So clearly, according to the patristics and the councils, you don't need two different natures to have a allegedly contradictory property. Same with the other analogies I gave with like the sky, right? So the sky is blue qua Hong Kong, but not blue qua Texas. The sky doesn't have two natures. So clearly, our analysis where we try to explain how something can have allegedly contradictory properties at the same time needs to be modified such that it accounts for that as well, because then it'll give it more explanatory power. So maybe a better solution would be some supposit X is material if there exists something such that Y is tangible and it communicates materiality to X. Now, also, I should point out that a good hypothesis should give a sufficient account of how qua operators are used in the incarnation, given that qualification is used in the tradition. Now, the model that I give in the following slides is going to be like similar to what Paul gives, and then it's going to modify it to sort of solve these problems that I see. So firstly, we can give the account of the body-soul analogy. Remember, right? Formalizing this analogy or giving like a solution to it is going to help us understand how we can solve the fundamental problem of Christology. So to begin, right, to sort of remind the viewers as to how the informal account works here, it's just going to be the two predicates, materiality and or materiality and immateriality, are going to be like communicated to the one subject via its various aspects. The body and soul are distinct, yet communicate materiality and immateriality to the one subject, which is the human person. So because material and immaterial are predicated in virtue of these different aspects, the statements the human person is material and the human person is immaterial are not using material in the same sense. So there's no contradiction, right? So the body-soul analogy is the person is material and immaterial because the soul is immaterial and his body is material. Now, we can give a formal model that kind of explains this. So first, what we can do is we can define like a set of predicates and a set of objects. So firstly, we can define the predicate I as there is some non-spatially extended object communicable qua immateriality to X. So what that's basically going to mean is that there's some truth maker or some object which communicates materiality to X. And then similarly, we can define M as like the same, except in terms of spatial extension rather than non-spatial extension. So in other words, what we're saying is that X is like derivative, it's material derivatively speaking, because it has an object communicating materiality to it, which is distinct from it. This is often referred to as piggybacking. So for example, let's say you have a wall that's composed of red bricks. The wall is red because of its parts, which are red. So it piggybacks off of the parts. Now, let's say something is material just in itself, not in virtue of something distinct from it. We're going to say that it's directly material, right? Now we can define our objects as like J is just going to refer to like the man, John, and then B and S are going to refer to his body and soul. And then the relation T is going to like apply to X and Y if X is communicated a materiality or immateriality by Y. And then we can say that the predicate F refers to something being directly material. G is going to refer to something being derivatively material. S is going to refer to something being directly immaterial. And P is going to refer to something being derivatively immaterial. So now that we've sort of given our terms and definitions, we can then formalize this using first order logic. So if you want to go to the next slide, that might be okay. So firstly, we can give the first, I guess you could say, statement in our model. So what our first statement says, once you like translate it, it's just going to be materiality simplicator implies either direct materiality or derivative materiality and vice versa. So basically what it's saying is that if we predicate materiality to something, we're either saying that it's directly tangible or that it's indirectly tangible. And then the second statement is just going to say the same thing, except with immateriality, right? So saying something is immaterial implies that it's directly immaterial or derivatively immaterial and vice versa. And then the third statement, or I'm sorry, no. The third statement is going to be saying something which is indirectly material is communicated materiality by something which is directly material and distinct from it. And then the fourth statement is going to be saying something which is indirectly immaterial is communicated materiality by something immaterial, or immateriality by something which is immaterial. And then finally, we have, I guess you could say, some conditions for how things communicate properties. So if X is communicated materiality or immateriality that by Y, then Y being material entails X is material. And likewise, Y being immaterial entails X is immaterial. So, like, for example, because the body communicates materiality to the person, if the body is material, it follows the person is material. Likewise, the soul communicates immateriality to the person. So if the soul is immaterial, it follows the person is immaterial. And then finally, we can get into how we're applying these properties to the things in question. So we can say, firstly, that John's body is directly material, but not derivatively, or John's body is directly material rather than being derivatively material. And then we can say John's soul is directly immaterial and not derivatively immaterial. Then we can say the body is material and the soul is immaterial. And then finally, we can say John's body and soul communicate materiality and immateriality to him. And then finally, we have John is both immaterial and material. Remember, right? The way we explain this informally is just by saying that, like, John is both material and immaterial, where he's material in his body, immaterial in his soul. Now, the proof tree there, the reason why I've included that is basically we've kind of explained this before, but if we put this model into like this proof tree generator, if this model was formally inconsistent, then it would result in like a contradiction. But since it doesn't result in a contradiction, it would follow that it's not inconsistent. And the reason why has to do with like how I guess you could say so-called classical logic works when it comes to the law of excluded middle and disjunctive syllogism. Basically, if something is contradictory, then from that contradiction, you can derive all contradictions and all propositions, meaning that if this model was contradictory, you would expect it to derive P and not P. But as we've seen with this proof tree generator, you cannot derive P and not P from this model. And that's going to demonstrate that it's not formally inconsistent because it, doesn't entail a contradiction. Now, remember, this is a formal model, though. So obviously, right? Like if I'm what's that called? I guess you could say just like explaining this to someone in an informal context, then it would make sense to give the informal explanation, right? But the reason why I've given a formal model is to show that like you can I guess you could say systematize this and formalize it and show that it's consistent using like just a proof. So now we can apply this model to Christ. So like we can just use the same definitions, except like just change J to be Jesus, and then now we have Jesus's particular body being referred to by B, and then S refers to Jesus's divine nature. Also note that S can be like substituted with Jesus's human soul, and the statements will retain their truth value. Now, if you go to the next slide, you're going to see that, hey, we have the same thing right here. And note, this is going to be like a model that explains how Christ is both material and immaterial. He's material through his body, but then immaterial through his divinity. And notice how there's no contradiction here. If you look at the proof tree, you'll see the same thing. There's no entailment of a contradiction. So clearly this is going to be like a formally consistent model of the like predicates material and immaterial being applied to Christ. Now, the important part is that you can do this for like any predicate. Like you can do this for like mortality and immortality, I don't know, like passibility, impassibility, etc. So, like finally, this is going to like explain like the LPI solution when it comes to the original argument. Remember, the original argument had to do with mortality and immortality. Now, mortality and immortality, as I said, are going to be predicated in two different senses, and this formal model like helps us explicate how. So, one refers to the ability of a body to be separated from the soul, and the other refers for the ability for the divine person to cease to exist. In other words, the predicates mortal and immortal aren't contradictory to each other in this context because they have different like non-exclusive truth conditions. This is why I said this is very similar to Timothy Paul's solution, because well, he says the same thing. These predicates aren't going to have contradictory or mutually exclusive truth conditions. And so you can also formalize this example of mortality and immortality. So like first you can say that like mortality just means that like something has a body and soul that are going to be united, but then it's possible for them to be separate, meaning that it's possible for something to be dead. And then immortality just means that like, a thing is just like eternal. And then once again, we can turn this into like a formal model. So if you look at that proof tree, once again, there's no contradiction. There's a new proof tree, by the way. Okay, are you on that one or?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, yeah, because so I gave multiple like proof trees showing that how none of these models entail a contradiction. So I mean, in a way, that kind of like shows decisively that BryceJ is correct, because this is a formal model of the incarnation, which is entirely consistent. And like as I've explained, all Bryce has to show is that like there's a model of the incarnation which is consistent and in line with like orthodoxy. Now, if you go down, I think we should probably explain some of our semantics a bit. So like, you have the next slide, by the way. Okay, so like as I said, we should explain our semantics because I use the term derivatively material and derivatively immaterial or similar semantics. I think it's best to kind of explain what's going on here by like using certain examples. So John's hand touched the sofa is a sufficient condition for John touched the sofa. John is derivatively touching the sofa because in this case, the property of touching is in some way piggybacked or communicated from the hand to the person. In other words, John is derivatively touching the sofa, but not directly because he's touching it through his hand. Now, John's hand also has an object from which it derives its property, right? So for like the sufficient conditions for John's hand touch the sofa are John's fingers touch the sofa. So what's interesting, right, is that John derives the property of touching from his hand, which derives it from his fingers. And then you can actually continue this chain onwards until we get to the very like atoms that constitute John's hand that directly interact with the sofa. Notice how like John derivatively touching the sofa is like sufficient to just say John touched the sofa simplicator. And this is going to be important because this shows that our semantics aren't ad hoc, because we simplify like derivative properties by just saying it applies simplicator all the times in ordinary language. So like you don't expect someone to say John's hand touched the sofa every time they talk about this kind of stuff. You just expect them to say John touched the sofa. Same thing with like if your brother sent you a letter, you're not going to say, "Oh, my brother talked to me qua a letter." You're just going to say, "Oh, my brother talked to me," right? Or my brother wrote something to me or something of that account. You're not going to say, "My brother derivatively spoke to me through this letter that he sent." In other words, you're going to simplify these qualifications like in ordinary language all the time, which demonstrates that this isn't going to be like an ad hoc maneuver, but rather like there's just going to be a simplification on the part of like ordinary language. Now, we can also give a logical model for like, or like a formal model for how like the whole like touching the sofa example works. So we can just distinguish the types of predicates we have again, and once again this is going to show that our formal model that we gave originally wasn't a contradictory or like an ad hoc model, because like if we can have similar models to explain ordinary statements here which work in basically the same way, then clearly we have prior precedent for our model. So once again, you can just define like S as X touch the sofa, and then you can define S1 as X touch the sofa, and the truth maker for this involves an object distinct from X, and then S2 as the same, except now the truth maker does not involve an object distinct from X. So the truth maker object just is the object basically. And what you can say is, firstly, right, is that the hand, the person, and then the fingers, and then the particular atoms in John are gonna like interact with the sofa simplicator. However, the person, the hand, the fingers are gonna all interact with the sofa derivatively or like indirectly, but then only the atoms are gonna interact with it directly. So once we understand this, we can actually give like a second logical model, which works in a very similar way to how we did the first model, but then we've like combined it with what we've learned here. So if you go to the next slide, we have a formulation of that. So once again, this is just going to give some definitions, right? I don't really have to go through each of these. I've already gone through them, and this is basically the same thing. Just note that we're distinguishing the types of properties here. So there's going to be like immateriality simplicator, and then there's going to be materiality directly, and then materiality derivatively, and then same thing for immaterial. However, we also have a new predicate, which is going to be like M3, which is what I've called it, and that's any object that is a truth maker qua materiality for X is material. In other words, that's going to mean X is material in every sense of the word, and that's going to be important when we get to the formal model. But if you go to the next slide, we can see how this model is applied to Christ. So we just said that like the divine nature is immaterial, the body's material, the soul is immaterial, and then we can say that like each of these is going to communicate properties to the one person, and then we can distinguish how the one person has the properties. Now, under this framework, being immaterial isn't necessarily the same as a negation of materiality in every sense. It, on the contrary, only requires a negation of immateriality in some sense. In other words, materiality and immateriality can be opposites, right? It's just that they're only opposites when we're qualifying the sense of it. So there's a sense of immateriality which is going to be contrary to a sense of materiality, but it's not going to be every sense of the word. And we kind of gave this example with the analogies we gave earlier, right? So with the body soul analogy, there's going to be a sense in which the man is material, but then there's going to be a sense in which he's immaterial, which is not contradictory to him being material. What's interesting is that this actually solves another problem with Paul's view, which is brought up. It's that, like, according to Paul, right, being immaterial isn't the same thing as not being material. And so being not F is not the same as being MF, where like F is some predicate. So being immaterial is not the same as not material. But under this model, interestingly, we can affirm that being not F is the same thing as being MF, because like you can say that being immaterial requires a negation of the predicate M3, which is just going to be materiality in every sense. So being immaterial in one sense requires that something is not material in all senses. In other words, this seems to solve a issue with Paul's semantics, which even he admits. Or like he admits that it's a problem of his semantics. I'm not sure if Paul would even approve of this model. I mean, it would be interesting to see how he would react to it. Now, finally, right, like we can ask the question, like, how does Christ's human body and soul serve as like truth makers for predications about him, and like how does it communicate materiality? But that's just going to be more of like a metaphysical issue, which we're going to get into later, rather than like a purely like logical issue, right? Because we've shown that this is formally consistent, and that's really all I have to do. Regardless, to quickly like answer this, one way to think about it would kind of be to say that like, hey, when it comes to the example of like the hand and how it communicates properties, the hand is in some way like intrinsic to the person, and that's how it communicates properties. And like in a similar way, like scholastics thought of like an essence as like being something intrinsic to a supposit from which certain properties flow. And like Timothy Paul also says something like this. So maybe you could say that like the human nature is going to be like intrinsic to the person, and in some way the properties flow from the nature to the person, or like they're communicated from the nature to the person. And this is just going to get into theories of subsistence and like composite Christologies, which that's going to be beyond the scope of like the LPI. But if you go to the next slide, what you're going to see is Paul basically gives this, where the idea is basically that an essential property is going to be like something that's had in virtue of an essence, right? So the idea is kind of like essences communicate properties to their subjects. I think Bustow might be able to speak to this a little more.
Oh yeah, actually, that is something I was looking into. That is the case. In St. Thomas brings it up in his Summa as well, where like he's talking about whether person is the same as hypostasis, subsistence, or essence. He kind of brings up something a little bit similar to it. In Prima Pars, question 29, Article 2, he says, according to the philosopher, aka Aristotle in metaphysics, subsistence substance is twofold. In one sense, it means the quiddity of a thing, signified by its definition, and thus we say that the definition means the substance of a thing, in which substance is called by the Greeks ousia, which we may call essence. In another sense, abstract, a substance means something or suppositum which subsists in a genus of substance. So when we say quiddity, the philosopher Aristotle, when he says like quiddity and like the later scholastics, they talk about like the whatness of something. So like its distinct properties and it's like what it truly is. So like when we talk about like God in his divine essence, like a part of like a quiddity of it would be like his being or like his subsistence or like existence.
Okay, so when we stopped at the video, he was getting into this idea of unmixed and undivided. I think we should continue off with that because it's going to show how Mike doesn't understand Chalcedon.
Right? You know, the hypostatic union actually tries to invent a third category. Let me give you a quick example. Did you know that the hypostatic union teaches that the natures are not divided or separate in the one person, but they're also not mixed? That's a blatant contradiction because these are opposite of each other. To say something isn't divided is to say they are mixed, and to say they aren't mixed is to say they are divided. And so this is the same for Jesus. To call him fully man and fully God is like calling a single shape fully circle and fully square. A square has four sides. That's what makes it a square. A circle has none. So the notion of a square circle is outside logical possibility. Right? It cannot exist. It's not real. A square circle, like a God man, is not real. If he's truly God and truly man, he's a fictional character, no different.
So this is honestly, Bryce even laughed at this argument. I don't know why he brought it up, but so we're going to be covering this next. If you look at the slideshow, so I don't think Mike really understands what we say when we say that Christ is unmixed and undivided. So one thing we have to remember is whenever we're like interpreting the conciliar text, most of the time those texts are going to be in context to someone being condemned. So you have to understand why the person is being condemned and the reasons behind like why they held to their views, etc. Right? So when it says Christ is unmixed, Christ's two natures are unmixed, then but yet not divided. They're kind of responding to like Eutychianism, which said that like, which they took to mean that like two natures aren't distinct after the union, and so that should frame how we interpret it. Now, firstly, right, Mike doesn't actually like explain what he means when he means mixed or divided, right? Like he doesn't actually give us any definitions of it. He does give an analogy, which we're gonna get into, right? But I mean, to give like a brief counter example, does like Mike think that the body and soul are like mixed with together, Well, they seem to be distinct in the person, so they're clearly not mixed in that sense. And yet, are they divided? Well, no, because death is the division of body and soul, or like the separation of it. So, if a person is alive, they would have to have a body and soul which aren't divided or separated from each other. Now, when we want to define like division and mixture, like for our purposes, we can just refer to like separate or like divided as like a negation of some form of unity. And in this context, the unity here is going to be like the unity in one person. So, the two natures are in the person and they communicate properties to the person. And yet when we say they're unmixed, the two sets of properties and the two natures, like they stay distinct from each other, right? The human nature is distinct from the divine nature. So, like, to give an example, this is something that Maximus gives, if I remember correctly. He says, like, you can give the example of a sword being heated in a fire. The sword retains its, like, natural properties. Likewise, the fire burns the sword and yet also retains its own natural properties. The sword, however, when it's left in fire, is not, like, mixed into the fire, but it's also not really spatially divided from the fire. So there's a sense in which it's not divided, meaning that it's not divided. And what this is important, right? Because this is going to provide another counter example to it, and it's also going to provide an analogy for like the incarnation, because like the sword is in a way like altered, or I guess you could say, in the context of the incarnation, we're going to want to say that like the human nature is somehow like deified, right, by the divine nature in the union, right? And so, in a similar fashion, the sword is kind of heated and altered in that way when it's in the fire. Under Bryce's model specifically, he's going to want to say that the human nature is like deified via the energies being like in the human nature in a way. Now, Mike's really like main or like only argument for like why being unmixed is the opposite of being undivided is he gives an analogy of like two physical liquids, and then he explains that they can't be mixed without being divided. But like, how does that entail that mixture and division are the only two logical possibilities for all things, right? Like saying any two liquids are either mixed or divided doesn't demonstrate that any two objects, regardless if they're liquid or non-liquid, are either mixed or divided, right? Like for example, suppose I said bacteria are bloodless and yet alive, and in response, someone says, "Well, look at this example of a human. If a human is bloodless, then it's dead, and if it's alive, it has blood. So therefore, bacteria can't be both bloodless and alive because in a human, being bloodless entails being dead. This is going to be fallacious, right? Because bacteria and humans aren't going to be the same." So Mike's argument doesn't really work. Now, Bryce kind of brings this up by saying that like this is a created analogy of like two physical objects. Mike's only argument is like, oh, well, you're using created analogies to explain it. But like obviously like the analogies aren't one to one. Plus, when we explain what it means, we appeal to like the historical context with like Eutyches and everything, right? So I don't know. I just don't think Bryce really understands what we. I'm not Bryce, but I don't think Mike understands what we mean when we talk about like how the two natures aren't mixed, but they're not divided either. Now, if you go to the next slide, this kind of gets into like how the theologian viewed kind of the union of the two natures in Christ, whilst also like maintaining their lack of mixture. So, like, firstly, like Jensen in his book "Divine Presence as Activity in the Incarnation," which is a pretty recent book, he kind of gives the Eastern account. So he says two theologians, confusingly both called Leontius of Byzantium and of Jerusalem, respectively, were able to do this. Again, the details of their individual contributions are not relevant here. The outcome of their endeavors is the notion of hypostasis. That is, the human nature finds its hypostasis in that of the divine logos. In order to safeguard the integrity of Christ's humanity, this required that Christ's human nature to include a complete individual human being. Hypostasis was taken to mean independence or final monadic being of oneself. This enabled Leontius to give an account of the incarnation in which the complete human nature, including body, soul, and personality, and everything else that makes it a human, truly human, does not have its own hypostasis, but rather it finds it in the logos, right? So Christ is human, and the human nature does have a corresponding like hypostasis. It's just that the corresponding hypostasis is none other than the divine hypostasis of the Word. So God, in one creative act, brought the human nature of Christ into existence and unified it with the divine hypostasis. So at no point does the human nature exist without the logos. It is always fully oriented in its very existence to the hypostasis of the logos. Conversely, this understanding of the hypostatic union allowed Byzantine theologians to say that Jesus Christ, God, suffers. The human individual Jesus Christ who suffers and dies is the existence of the hypostasis of the Logos, right? So Jesus Christ just is the Logos. So that's how the Eastern theologians explained it, right? It's that the human nature is somehow in the divine hypostasis alongside with the divine nature, right? So the human and divine natures are in the one person. And so that's why we say they're undivided from each other, because they're in one person. And so in that sense, they're united. But then the way that we say that they're unmixed is just going to be like the sets of properties are like going to be different, and the human nature doesn't become like consumed or like identical with the divine nature, right? Like we maintain a distinction between the divine and human natures, and that's why they're going to say they're unmixed. And then when it comes to like the Western view, Richard Cross quotes Boethius as saying, "Since then, the Catholic faith confesses both that both natures continue in Christ and that they both remain perfect, neither being transformed into each other. It says with right that Christ consists both in and from the two natures. In the two natures because both continue, and from both natures because the one person is formed by the union of two continuing natures." So once again, you have this idea that like the kind of thing they're getting at is that the both natures remain distinct after the union. So it's not like the divine nature becomes identical to the human nature or vice versa, right? That's the thing they're trying to avoid, right? But then at the same time, they want to say that the human nature and divine nature are going to be like in the one person. So that's how they're explicating division and in mix, like that's how they're explicating mixture and division, right? So when you look at the truth conditions for what it would mean for the human and divine natures to be mixed or undivided, what you see is that they're not really giving contradictory truth conditions when they explicate their model. And so there's not really going to be any contradiction between the two. Now, we could also look at the Protestant West. So for here, we have our representative, like for the Protestant West being Martin Chemnitz. Obviously, like the Calvinists might disagree a little bit with like the Christology, but I don't think they're going to disagree with the idea of like two natures in one person. So I think it's fine to quote Chemnitz here. But basically, he says that from this discussion, we can understand to some extent what Paul means when he describes the hypostatic union in Christ as he does in Colossians 2:9. The whole fullness of the Godhead dwells in him bodily. Damascus calls this the indwelling and interpenetration and describes it by the example of the union of the soul and with the body, and with fire with iron. Therefore, in the incarnate Christ, the continued difference of the two natures must be understood not as something which attaches itself only in a superficial way, as when a small pebble clings to a huge rock, or like when two different strips of gold and iron are glued together, between which there is no real communion, but the hypostatic union takes place by interpenetration. Nor must we fear the conversion or mingling of the two natures, if their mutual interpenetration is of the same quality as that of the soul and the body, or of fire and iron. For it is manifest that even to our reason that in these instances the difference of the natures remains intact. Notice how he's like explicating the difference of the natures via like looking at how the natures remain distinct. Then he says, although the light is something distinct from the body of the sun, yet it cannot be separated from it because of the interpenetration. In the case of fire united with the iron, if it should come to exist or be placed or depicted somewhere apart from and separate from the iron, so that it is no longer united with the iron, then the union will have been dissolved. And the soul, if and when or whenever and wherever it is without its body is and outside the body, then obviously it is no longer united or remains with its body, but is separated from it. Although the assuming nature in Christ is infinite and the assumed nature remains finite, yet because of the hypostatic union, such a relationship is produced between the infinite and the finite that one hypostasis is constituted. The two natures are united with each other in an intimate and most present union, inseparably and indivisibly. We have referred to these terms above. So if I insist on believing, understanding, and considering the divine nature of the Logos by itself, at some distance from and outside the assumed humanity, I would thereby dissolve the hypostatic union of the two natures in Christ, as we have pointed out above. Now, also, I would like to point out, right, like Chemnitz actually gives like a very in-depth explanation of like the different types of unions and explains why they don't apply to Christ. he gives like 14 different types of unions, and then finally he gives which type of union applies to Christ, which is the 15th type. So like Chemnitz begins by saying, when Cyril attempted to describe the hypostatic union of the two natures in Christ, he distinguished and separated it from other different and related kinds of unions, so that he must thus arrive at examples of similar unions and finally establish the specific difference of the union in Christ. Damascus also imitated this method, and since some light can be thus shed on this doctrine, we shall too indicate certain things about the various kinds of unions. Union is a general term indicating a uniting of two or more distinct things, so that it takes so that from these one thing is produced. And then he says it takes place in various ways. Then he gives us 14 different types of unions, which are going to be too long to cover in the stream. But then, like, he just rejects them all as applying to Christ. But finally, he says there is union by hypostasis, like the union of body and soul in a man, not as those pertain to the constituting of one nature, but to the constituting of one hypostasis. In the foregoing, we have explained, partly by rejection and partly by comparison, how the specific difference of the hypostatic union of the two natures in Christ has been constituted. So, like, notice how, like, the Chalcedonian theologians give a pretty, like, specific and, like, explicit view of what they mean when they talk about, like, union and then the lack of mixture. So, like, the fact that Mike is kind of seems to be, like, unaware of this and, like, unaware of, like, how we explicate it, it's kind of, like, odd, right? Like, why is he debating on this when he doesn't know this? Now, finally, we can get to, like, if you go to the next slide, we can get to, like, Mike and what he thinks about, like, how natures are just, like, abstract sets. Do we want to, like, watch the part where he says that, by the way?
Okay, let's start with the logic, because that's where I started. Okay, he told me that I don't understand about the point of origination of properties. And then he followed that up by claiming that natures have the ability to suffer. Folks, natures are abstract. He accused me of nominalism. Folks, I understand some nominalists will say that abstract things have no existence whatsoever, but things that exist in the mind still exist. They're just in the mind. Okay, the difference between who you are and what you are coextensive, which means they extend over the same time and space. So who I am and what I am don't actually exist separately in the real world. Those are two aspects of one thing. Okay, actually, it's him who doesn't understand the point of origination. Okay, absolutely, that's going to apply to Christ. He said the laws of logic aren't in the Bible. Wrong.
All right, we can pause it there. So, like, as you can see, like, his entire claim, and this is actually going to be, like, relevant to, like, the Qua move, because his reason for rejecting the Qua move also boils down to this claim right here. So, essentially, he's just saying that natures are abstract, and that, like, the divine nature is just going to be, like, a set of properties, and then the human nature is going to be, like, a set of properties as well. But the issue is, this isn't something that you can assume in Christological discussions, right? Because firstly, like, the divine nature is only an essence by analogy. Properly speaking, it's not even an essence or like a universal, right? It's definitely not a mere set of properties either. Likewise, when we say human nature, although we could be referring to an abstract object such as an immanent universal, in Christological discussions, it is often or like typically going to refer to like a concrete and like particular composite of body and soul. So when we say Christ assumed a human nature, this is going to refer to like the assumption of the composite of body and soul. Also note that like the abstract nature position is in analytic Christology discussions. It seems to be like a minority, right? So Mike is kind of assuming a minority position. We're going to do like a survey of scholars and of like historical positions in a bit, right? I should also point out that this is a claim that he's made consistently in the past, that like natures are only abstract, and so that's why the Qua move fails. Now we've already attacked that on one front by showing that we don't have to like say that like the Qua move only involves specifying the subject. You can also modify the predicate. So that's already going to be like explaining how that is a blunder, right? Because obviously, like his critique is only going to be applicable to the S model, but that's not enough to refute the Qua move because there's multiple different models of that. Regardless, this is a repeated thing that he said. And so this is a repeated mistake, despite the fact that the literature about this topic doesn't take this assumption for granted. So that's going to like question, like, has Mike actually read the literature on like Christology and like the metaphysical debates over it? Because if he has, he should be aware of this. And if he's aware of it, why is he bringing it up? So if you go to the next slide, we can begin our, I guess you could say, analysis. So firstly, we can use Richard Cross's definition for like concrete and abstract. Now obviously Cross's definition isn't going to be like, I guess you could say like perfect, but I think it's a good starting place. So what he says is like concrete is just going to be something which is a bearer of properties, like specifically non-trivial properties. Now, he doesn't give a definition of like what non-trivial properties are, but it should be like pretty obvious, right? So non-trivial properties would be like impassible, passable, immortal, mortal, etc. Whereas something like is a nature or is a hypostasis, etc., or like is united to a hypostasis, etc., or like is a universal. Like those are going to be like trivial properties. Now, maybe like to improve on Richard Cross's definition, you could say that like a concrete object is something described by first order predicates such as passable, impassable, etc. But then a trivial property is going to be something like a second order predicate such as is a universal, right? So non-trivial properties would just be second order properties if we go by Cross's analysis. And so in Christological discussions, we can just say that like a concrete thing is just going to be like a bearer of first order predicates. And then abstract objects would just be things which aren't concrete in a way. Now, he then says we can actually divide concreteness into two different types, right? So we can say there are those bearers of properties that are themselves born by something else. Like an example of this, right? He gives is like a wall. So a wall can be red because all of its parts are red. So the wall like piggybacks off of the parts of the wall. And so in that way, right, you can say the parts of the walls are kind of like communicating the property of the redness to it. However, there are also concrete objects which are not born by anything else, right? So, like for example, Aristotelian primary substances are not going to be held by another. So, what he wants to say is that concrete nature picks out property bearers, which themselves are born by further concrete items such as primary substances. So like maybe you can use the example of like a hand. Maybe you can say a hand isn't a primary substance, but rather is going to be like a concrete object, but it's going to be like a concrete object which is born by something else, that being a person. So that's going to explain sort of where we're coming at when it comes to concrete natures. But now we can actually do like a historical survey as to like who believes what and why. So, firstly, Andrew Loke on his 2016 text on Christology called Cryptic Christology is going to go into this. And he gets into like the concrete nature debate. And what he says is like, on the concrete view, natures are fundamentally concrete particulars. On this view, Christ's human nature was fundamentally a concrete particular. This view does not deny that the particular had certain human properties. On an abstract view, natures are fundamentally properties, right? Now, notice under abstract views, they're not going to deny that Christ has like a human body, right? Like there's obviously going to be concrete aspects in the assumption. It's just a question of what are like what does the term fundamentally refer to? And then on page 72, Locke actually says that he prefers the concrete view. And he does it because it allows for the qua move. Now, what's interesting, right, is that like metaphysics Mike should definitely know about Andrew Locke because he's just like he's a well-known Christian apologist in general. So like metaphysics Mike should definitely know about him. So like the fact that he doesn't know about this debate is kind of weird. But regardless, right? Timothy Pawl, quoting the Tome of Leo, points out how the Tome of Leo says that like the human nature hung on a cross, and then he points out that like that only makes sense if the human nature is a concrete object. So he's saying that like the Tome of Leo supports the concrete nature view. And Paul like also argues that the concrete nature view has like historical precedent because like he cites Cyril, and then he also argues that later medieval scholars saw this as the correct view. So he cites he cites secondary sources such as McCord, Stump, and Cross to like go over medieval text and take this view. Once again, Timothy Pawl is basically standard in like Christology discussions, so Mike should definitely be aware of this. Likewise, the Tome of Leo is literally the source for Bryce's Christology because Bryce's position infallibly holds to the Tome of Leo. Then you can see what Oliver Crisp says. So once again, he gives he gives this debate. Once again, Oliver Crisp is like pretty standard reading in these types of discussions. Now he does say that like there's been insufficient like attention given to the concrete versus abstract view. But to be fair, right, this was released in 2007, so a lot has changed since then, and we're gonna go over that obviously. But basically, Oliver Crisp takes the concrete nature view as well. And he actually does agree with it. And like he says, the medievals would also agree with that. So like, for example, I'm pretty sure like he cites, I think they would cite people like Scotus or like Thomas Aquinas or the various, I think Peter Lombard as well, I think. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to get into some medievals, as I said. So Richard Cross gives the examples of Peter Chanter and John Duns Scotus. And Richard Cross gets into this idea of communicatability, in which how Peter Chanter kind of thought as like a human nature as like this concrete object, which was communicated to the human, which was communicated to the divine person, and thus fails to be like a subsistent individual, and that's how he avoids Nestorianism. But note, right, is that under this view, under Peter Chanter's view, it's going to be the case that like the human nature is still going to be concrete. So Peter Chanter seems to take a concrete nature view. Similarly, right, Scotus directly says that like Christ's human nature is in a way a substance and is like the subject of accidents. But and the way he explicates that is not by saying it's like a hypostasis, but rather it's just going to be like a particular composite of body and form, or matter and form. Because for them, right, the body was like the matter and the soul was the form. And when you combine the two, you get like a particular substance. So Christ's human nature, although it's not a person, it is a substance in that sense, and it's going to have accidents within it. So Scotus seems to take a concrete nature view. Then Thomas Aquinas, if you go to the next slide, right? Okay, you're on it. Nice. He also directly says that like the human nature is assumed in atomo as like, or in atomo as like John of Damascus says, right? So that being it's individual in a way, right? So it's going to be like a particular or like concrete. And he gives the analogy of like how the hand of Socrates, although it's individual in some sense, meaning like it's a particular object distinct from other particulars, it's not going to be a person or a hypostasis because it doesn't exist in itself, but rather in something more perfect, that being the person. It's like under Thomas Aquinas' view or like account of the incarnation, the human nature of Christ is like in a way, a substance that is created and assumed by the word. It lacks its own essay, that being act of existence, and thus isn't like it's not a hypothesis or like a person, but given that it's like a primary substance for his view, it's obviously concrete. We should also be careful not to equivocate on like primary substance, right? Like under some views, primary substance is going to be like a hypostasis and nothing else, right? But under for Thomas Aquinas, when he's defining the term primary substance, he wants to argue that like a sufficient condition for something being a primary substance is going to be like it having like a matter and form and it being constituted by the two. And I think Bustdown can talk about that as well.
Yeah, there. So when he's talking about it, he usually also will somewhat equate it to like an essence that is being attributed to something. But there are also other places in the Summa and in other works that he has that we can kind of look into, because when he also like talks about the nature, he brings it up in as a relation as well. So in Tertia Par's question 2, and then article 3, which is the following article from this, he says, some who did not know the relation of the hypostasis to person, although granting that there is but one person in Christ, held nevertheless there is one hypostasis in God and another man, and hence the union took place in the person and not in the hypostasis. So like when he's talking about there being this relation, he's saying there's going to be a relation to a concrete object, which would be like something like the hypostasis. And then in another section of Tertia Pars, in question 17, article 2, at the end of his response, he says, and thus, since the human nature is united to the Son of God hypostatically or personally, as we've said above, and then he cites his earlier like answer to question 2 in articles 5 and 6, and not accidentally, it follows that the human nature therefore accrued to him no new personal being, but only a new relation to a pre-existing personal being to the human nature, in such a way to the person that is said to subsist not merely in divine, but also in the human nature. So now, because there's this idea of matter and a new relation being established to the person of the word, it would only follow that like this is going to be something that is concrete, that is being related to. And then in another work, whenever he's talking specifically to like pagans and Jews in Summa Contra Gentiles, he answers the questions on like what terms can be predicated onto God. And usually he talks about like predications to these things can be in a metaphorical sense. So like when we say like the hand of God, that's like a metaphorical sense to like kind of conjure an idea in our mind. But he brings up this. where we can signify something, or when we say something, it can signify that it's something concrete. So and because God is his nature, simply, we can say that his nature that the nature is then concrete. St. Thomas writes, quote, accordingly, in every term employed to us, there is imperfection as regards to the mode of signification, and imperfection is unbecoming of God, although the thing signified is becoming to God in some eminent way. For example, the term goodness or the good. For goodness signifies by way of non-subsistence, and the goodness signifies by way of concretion. In this respect, no term is becomingly applied to God, but only in respect that which the term is employed to signify. So what he's saying here is that when we use terms to predicate things on the God, so like his goodness, we're saying this is to signify something that is concrete, that which is in God. So from this, it follows that that natures are concrete objects.
So after like this, we can also look at latter and force. Like before, we've kind of covered like whether or not the human nature is going to be concrete versus abstract, right? But there's also like a debate with like the divine nature, and like the medieval West is like decisive. Like with the abstract view, it's not going to be like condemned. I don't think it's condemned, at least in like the Catholic view. Maybe you can argue that it's like implied by the Tome of Leo, but I think you can give the interpretation that like the Tome of Leo is just using like a different semantics than what we use today, right? So in their semantics is going to be concrete. Regardless, though, I don't think you can really have an abstract interpretation of the divine nature, because like that is like directly condemned. So like there was basically kind of this guy named Jehoiakim, and Buston can speak to this in a bit, but he was condemned for saying that like the divine nature is like properly a universal, rather than like only by analogy, and he was condemned for saying there's like a real distinction between the divine nature and the persons. And so Lateran 4 basically like dogmatized the position that the divine nature is kind of like it's a real and particular reality which is identified with the three persons, rather than being a distinct universal which is only in the persons, like how an immanent universal would be in hypostasis.
You could also say this is a for some later theologians talk about it as a little bit termed as like a quote unquote quasi universal, where
Yeah.
you can like distribute the term God to the three persons perfectly, but it's not like an actual universal, because if you want like a reason as to why, St. Thomas brings up in the Prima Pars, I think it's in question 3 or question 6. He brings up whether he asks the question of whether God is a genus, and his answer is no, and he gives like 3 reasons why.
Yeah. So basically like what the condemnation at Lateran 4 says is going to be like that there exists a certain supreme reality, incomprehensible and ineffable, which is true, which truly is the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the three persons together and each one of them separately. That is to say, right, that is to say, substance, essence, or divine nature, which alone is the principle of all things, besides which no other principle can be found. Then it says the Father's substance is indivisible, inasmuch it is together simple. Notice, right, these are not going to be properties that are like attributed to abstract objects, such as like a set of properties. So it's pretty clear that it's not going to be an abstract set in this instance. And then if you go to the next slide, we're going to see more examples when it comes to like Thomism and Lutheranism. So, right, so this is from like a text on like Thomas Aquinas' Trinitarian view. It says, in designating the persons as one, Aquinas does not mean that they are merely at the like he doesn't mean that they are merely one at the level of abstraction or secondary substance as humans are, but because there's no real distinctions between essence and supposit. The persons are truly one instead of notionally one. Number, as applied to God, only signifies the undividedness of the essence slash unity of the persons, or the undividedness of each of the persons in relative distinction from. And then he says multiplicity is only applied relatively to God. It only signifies a plurality of relations in God. The essence is not a fourth because it is not relatively opposed to the persons, right? So kind of the idea here is that when we say divine essence, we're using essence analogically. Properly speaking, the divine essence isn't an immanent universal. And then Martin Chemnitz says something similar. So this is also going to be the case with Lutheranism. He quotes, like, he cites Augustine, and he says, like, the divine essence is predicated of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, not as a genus predicated of different species, or as a species predicated of an individual, or as a whole of its parts, but in an entirely ineffable and incomprehensible way. The hypostasis or presence of the Trinity are all one because of the identity of essence. Now, like, for context, unity of species or in genus would be like kind of what it's like what Mike thinks we have, right? Because for Mike, he thinks that we have like a unity and abstract set of properties, right? But like Chemnitz is denying this exact notion and is siding in favor of Lateran form. And then, so this is going to obviously be important because like Chemnitz is denying the like abstract view of the divine nature. He's saying that no, the divine nature isn't like just an abstract set of properties which the persons share, but rather it's going to be analogically a universal, not properly. So the divine nature, like Lateran 4 says, it's going to be like a one simple, like undivided reality which the persons are identified with, and that's how they're one. And then he also cites, when it comes to the human nature, he cites the same Damascus quote that Thomas Aquinas cited, and he does the same thing where he argues that like it's a like a particular human nature, as he puts it, right? So it's going to be like it's particular human body and soul that he's assuming. Now, finally, we can also give like a synthesis of like the concrete versus abstract views. So like this is kind of what Oliver Crisp notes is that like the difference is more like about what the human nature fundamentally is, right? Because under both views, there's going to be an abstract set of properties which Christ has in virtue of his humanity, right? Like nobody denies that. Likewise, there's going to be like a concrete particular that is Christ's body, and nobody denies that either. The question is more so like whether or not the human nature is fundamentally like a body and soul composite, or whether it's like an abstract set of properties. The issue is, right, is that like when it comes to the, let's say, the Qua move, or when we say something like the human nature like suffered on a cross or something like that, right? Obviously, given the context, that's going to be referring to like a concrete nature. So like Mike, when he says like, oh, natures are abstract, he's just going to be straw manning the view. And that's kind of like the whole point here is that natures are like concrete if you go by the medieval view, at least in this context, even if they can be abstract in like other contexts. So in other words, Mike is equivocating on what nature means. Now, if you go to the next slide, so like as I said above, right, this seems to be like consensus, right? Like what I'm describing. So like what I'm describing is like very standard in like analytic theology discussions. Like so, for example, Richard Cross, Oliver Crisp, Timothy Pawl, they're going to be like very standard when it comes to these discussions. They're going to be representative of the debate of like analytic philosophers in this domain. Like for example, like McCord is cited in the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy in its entry on the Incarnation. Similarly, like the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on philosophy and Christian theology cites both Paul and Cross in terms of the Incarnation, if I remember correctly. I know with Paul it does. With Cross it cites them, but I don't know if it cites the specific book I used. Regardless, Cross has a lot of books about that cover the Incarnation. So this is important, right? Because Mike should be aware of this, and he should have read this literature prior to debating the topic. So, like, this is just going to show, like, either like Mike is like intentionally strawmanning, meaning that like he knows this is the case, and yet he's still like saying that natures are abstract and strawmanning our view, or he's like unintentionally doing it, in which case he would just be like not well read on the topic, which both are obviously problematic. Now, perhaps like Mike, Mike can say, "Oh, well, I knew about this. It's just that I rejected it a priori because if the human nature is a concrete particular, then it's going to be a hypostasis and a person. So the concrete nature view falls into Nestorianism, which is why I reject it." First of all, he doesn't say that. Second of all, we can easily get around this. So, like, firstly, there's like the Miaphysite solution. It's going to be the idea that like Christ does not have two natures after the union, and that the duality is only like in theoria or in thought, and so there's not two natures in reality, and thus there's only going to be like one person. And the way they would solve like the LPI is like using like a something analogous to like a composite Christology, where they're going to have like the human nature or like the humanity and divinity are going to be like constituents of the one composite nature, and that's how they explain how the one person can have materiality, immateriality, passibility, impassibility, and so forth. However, the Chalcedonian solution, which is going to be more relevant to the debate topic, because Bryce is Chalcedonian and Mike's critiques are of Chalcedon. The solution that Chalcedonians gave is basically like being a concrete nature and or being a substance is not sufficient for being a hypostasis or person. Thus, this does not fall into Nestorianism. So when we go further into depth, what we call like what I'm referring to is going to be like theories of subsistence. And a useful analogy to kind of understand what's going on here is like the contemporary debates over personhood. Intuitively, we understand that persons exist and that there are also non-personal objects. It's like John is a person, Peter is a person, but like a rock or a squid are not persons. And that raises the question, right? Like, what are the necessary or like sufficient conditions for like John and Peter being personal, but then like a rock and a squid aren't personal? And like accounts of personhood are going to like seek to explain that. But then, like in a similar fashion, the medievals like recognize that some things are like independent or like individual or like complete in like ways that other things aren't. It's like a person, a rock, a cat are like independent and individual, whilst like something like a human hand, a universal, an eyeball are not going to be individual or like independent in the same sense, right? And so theories of subsistence kind of seek to explain why these objects have that type of individuality. And so what they're going to say is that those objects have like subsistence. So like a cat, a rock, a person subsist, whereas like a hand, an eyeball, or like a universal don't subsist, at least not on their own. And so like the medievals kind of like it's going to be analogous to like our debates about personhood. That kind of was their debate about personhood, right? So when something subsisted or had subsistence, what the medievals refer to it as, like they would call it a supposit or like a hypostasis. And then they use their account of subsistence to give an account of personhood. Because personhood for them requires one, being of a rational nature, so rationality, and two, being a supposit. So their account of personhood was dependent upon their theory of subsistence. So a person is like a rational supposit under their view. And this is crucial because like when we understand why the concrete nature doesn't like collapse into Nestorianism, uh, obviously, if the concrete nature isn't going to be a subsistence, it's not going to be a hypostasis, and thus it can't be a person. So this is important because if you go to the next slide, like they literally explain why it cannot be a subsistence, right? So firstly, right, under the Thomist view, Thomas Aquinas is going to give the analogy of like a hand. So he's going to say like a hand is a particular, a hand is concrete, and in some sense it's like a substance because it's a composite of matter and form, but it does not have its own individuality in terms of like being a subsistence, right? So for him, the hand does not have its own act of existence. It exists in the person, but not independently from the person. So, like, for example, in the same quote I quoted above, he says, not every individual in the genus of substance, even in a rational nature, is a person, but that alone which exists by itself, and that does not which exists in a more perfect thing. Hence, the hand of Socrates, although it is a kind of individual, is not a person, because it does not exist by itself, but in something more perfect, that being the whole. And hence, too, this is signified by a person being defined as an individual subsistence, for the hand is not a complete substance, but part of a substance. Therefore, although this human nature is a kind of individual in the genus of substance, it does not have its own personality because it does not exist separately, but is in something more perfect, that being the person of the word. Therefore, the union took place in the person. And then Thomas V. Morrison is The Logic of God Incarnate gives like a similar explanation. So he says, in Christ, the human body and soul were not independent. We're not like an independent whole, but we're joined to the divine person of God the Son as the human nature in which the divine suppositum dwelt. Not being an independent whole, but only a part of a greater whole, which was God incarnate, they did not alone constitute or characterize a suppositum distinct from that single person who was the Christ, or from that single eternal suppositum dwelling in both the divine and human natures. Hence, to admit that in Christ there was a human body and human soul is not to thereby admit that in Christ there was a human person distinct from the divine person. Consequently, taking both the true humanity and the true divinity of Christ does not commit one to a double person or double suppositum view as Christ. Such was the Aquinas' argument. Now, When it comes to Peter Chanter and John Duns Scotus, they use the notion of communicability. So kind of I use this argument, like I use this analogy when it came to like the hand, right? So like I get like a while ago I gave the analogy of kind of like how a hand communicates like touching to like a person, right? So if a hand touches a sofa, that's a condition sufficient condition for a like a person touching that sofa. And that has to do because the hand is communicable to the person. And so what Peter Chanter like says is that this can be applied to the human nature. The human nature is not an incommunicable thing. Rather, it's going to be communicable to the second person of the Trinity. And because being a hypostasis requires being incommunicable, the human nature isn't a hypostasis, and thus the human nature isn't a person. And then likewise, John Duns Scotus says like a similar thing, where he kind of compares like the human nature of Christ to an accident, right? Now this is by analogy, right? So it's not properly an accident; it's only analogically one. But in that analogy, like an accident is not going to be like a subsisting individual. Rather, it's going to be like something that inheres or like acts as like a truth maker for like a subject, which in a way like as I said, is communicable to it. And so, in a similar way, right, Scotus's view is like that the human nature of Christ is communicable to the person and thus fails to be a person, but then at the same time, it's like a truth maker for it. So, and that's how someone like Scotus would avoid the Nestorianism problem. It's like, similar, it's like I've quoted Richard Cross and like Labouie's text on John Duns Scotus. Now, if we go to the next slide, right, this is how Leontius and Damascene kind of avoid this. So we've already mentioned Jensen, right? The idea is that the human nature, although it's concrete and although it's like a particular composite of body and soul, it's not going to be a person because it exists in the hypostasis of Christ. And the hypostasis corresponding to the composite of body and soul isn't a second human hypostasis, but rather it's the divine hypostasis. And John of Damascus similarly used the idea of like in hypostasis as well, right? So the kind of idea is like the human nature is intrinsic to Christ and thus doesn't constitute a separate person. So in a way, like it's sort of similar to like a hand, right? Because the human nature, like it is intrinsic to the person and is communicated to the person, and so it is not its own hypostasis. And then similarly, like Richard Cross quotes another medieval theologian. Honestly, I don't know how to pronounce his name. Maybe Buston can help me with that. His like Latin is better than mine. Buston, would you know?
For actually, Praepostin. I'm pretty sure it's like Praepostinus.
Okay, Prepostinus, what he says, right, and this is going to be quoted in Richard Cross's recent 2024 text on like early scholastic Christology. He basically says like the description of the description person is a rational substance of an individual nature should be understood such that the individual nature is neither posited in the constitution of anything nor united to anything greater than it. So the soul which is in constitution of the human being should not be called a person. Neither should the human nature of the word, which was united to something greater than it, be accorded to be the name of a person. So kind of idea, right, is that he actually gives the analogy of like a soul. So the soul isn't a person, it's part of a person, it's intrinsic to the person, and thus it fails to be a person. Likewise, the human nature is intrinsic and communicable to the person of Christ, and therefore it fails to be a person. So that, like, to sum it up, let's kind of get into like theories of subsistence, which as I explained, the idea is that like being a person requires being a hypostasis, and being a hypostasis requires being a subsistence, and subsistence requires certain conditions. Because those conditions are not met by the human nature of Christ, the human nature does not qualify as a subsistence, and thus that's how they would avoid Nestorianism.